Hi everyone, I'm Jeff Booth, the Director of Product here at Opendock, and this is our very first official What's Up Doc podcast, and I'm joined by my co-host, Calissa Pollard.
Hello everyone, I'm the Senior Product Manager for Opendock. Super excited to be here with Keith Moore.
And Keith Moore is the Chief Product Officer of AutoScheduler. Keith, tell us a little bit about you.
Hey, Jeff, Calissa, thank you guys so much for having me on. So my name's Keith Moore. A little bit about myself. So I'm an engineer by training. And so I started my career working in a really sexy industry called test and measurement, which is a bunch of, it was kind of IoT before IoT became a thing. So sensorization, data acquisition, control systems. I did a lot of really fun work. So, for example, worked with like SpaceX on designing control systems for their self-landing rockets, and did a lot of work in semiconductor around chipset testing and trying to make cell phone batteries last longer. And I realized that I was giving all of my customers more data than they could ever use, right? I was generating gigabytes of data per second in some of these scenarios, and nobody had the processing power, the compute to actually handle it. So I actually shifted my career into artificial intelligence, helped launch a company here in Austin that was really small. It's now a unicorn, and kind of cut my teeth in. I'll call it. I'm using air quotes for everybody that can't see me, but artificial intelligence and pure play AI, and how to apply machine learning to large data sets to actually solve vertical problems in industry. I did that for about 5 years, and then I really wanted to do something that was vertically focused. So I got together with some of the best minds in the supply chain space, logistics space, and we launched AutoScheduler. So AutoScheduler is a company focused on being kind of the brain of a warehouse. So for every distribution center or warehouse out there, there are a lot of different software pieces and then a lot of personnel responsible for making decisions on how to run those operations. And what AutoScheduler is focused on is kind of pulling all of that data together, doing a bunch of really advanced optimization and finding the optimal plan for how you need to execute on all of the different work streams to make sure that you're maximizing fill rates, maximizing customer success and delivery, and minimizing cost. It's a really interesting problem, and we've been around since August of 2020, so still a fairly new company. But that's me in kind of a short little nutshell.
That's awesome, especially since I really attack like jargon whenever I hear like jargon or things like that. And I feel like everyone says data, data, data. And I always make the joke, well, if you had all the data, what would you do with it? And the answer is usually not a lot because there's too much of it. And so I like that you're talking about what you do with all that data. And Calissa has a data background academically. Calissa, any thoughts on the data world and the buzzwords and what it actually means to you?
It is chaotic, and I feel like I'm mostly a data janitor. Is that kind of how you feel every day
All the
too,
time.
Keith?
It's, what data do we have? What data do we need? What does a good project look like? How can I use artificial intelligence, blanket term with no definition provided? Completely agree with you in that even sorting people through the data they need to solve the problems they have is a huge challenge and something that we have to deal with all the time.
Yeah, I think sometimes people think, oh, the data will there's just this concept of data spits out and it tells you exactly what to do. And I've had the fortunate opportunity to work at some pretty big companies where they're like, here's all of this data. Now what? It's like, well, I don't know. Like I worked at a grocery store like Sprouts. I'm like, I know people buy bananas with tomatoes. Great. Now that we know that, what do we do with it? And the answer for most places is not a lot. And so it's cool to hear about a tool like AutoSchedule where it's like, hey, we actually take this data and do something useful with it.
It's I kind of equate it to the IBMism, and you guys may have already heard this before, but anytime you talk about like the analytics adventure that companies go on, you always hear like, well, we're going to get our data and we're going to put it in a data lake. You're like, okay, what does that mean? And so like the three tiers of the data strategy that most people walk through is first the visibility. Do I have my data? Can I use that to understand either in current course or historically what has happened? So the tomato banana example. And then the second piece is they try to get a little more intelligent. Like, can you be predictive with my data? Can my data not only tell me where I am, but also where I'm going? And then that third piece, which is really challenging for a lot of companies to move towards, is that prescriptive piece. And I know that I'm just dropping buzzword after buzzword after buzzword here, but it's not just, I know where I am, I know where I'm going, but it's, I know where I'm going and I want to prescribe, I have some objective. What is my objective and how can I change my course of action to maximize my future outcome? Because whatever that is, whatever my goal is, how can I get to that goal at the highest rate possible? And that's where, any organization that starts to focus on the data journey, that's kind of where they want to go. But almost everybody struggles with all the steps along the way to get there from, for one reason or another. And I'm sure, Calissa, you've seen that, across your career as well.
Yeah, definitely. So where are most of your data inputs coming from? Where would you say most of
Yeah,
them?
so I'll get really warehousing specific for a bit. Because we focus, when we launched Autoscheduler, our goal, I'd done pure play AI and I did work in, financial services and flew around the world with hedge funds and had done work in oil and gas and worked on offshore oil rigs, right? And I wanted to be vertically aggressively good at just one thing and be really good at that one thing. And that one thing was warehousing. And so most of the data that we're getting is going to be from a warehouse management system. And when we're talking about data available in a warehouse management system, it's a few things. So inventory. So you need to know what inventory you have, where it is. So as well as things like its shelf life, when it's going to expire, when it needs to ship, its freshness period. You need to know how it even cubes out. So like length, width, height, weight. Um, you need to know location data. So what locations exist, what locations are close to other locations or far away from other locations, because I don't want to take an inventory that's in the northeast corner of the warehouse and send it to a door in the southwest corner. Um, I need to know things like orders and shipments. So what needs to leave the building? When does it need to leave? So this is, again, for what you guys are doing with Opendock, a really good fit on understanding what is the appointment time, what is the deliverable where there is something inside of the warehouse that has to meet something in the transportation world in the field of a carrier. I need to know receivables. So which trailers are coming in? When are they coming in? What carriers are bringing them? How much does it cost if we don't unload them in time? Um, and then the last thing that I might be looking for is some information about the yard. How many trailers are on the yard? What information do I have about those trailers? Because anytime you're doing work inside of a distribution center, you need to understand, do I have the inventory? Do I have the labor and capacity? Do I have the space? And then do I even have something to put it in or something to load that trailer with? And so that's kind of some of the information that we need. There's a lot more we can do around, if it's a production site, we need the production schedule. If we want to get a further plan into the future and what we're building with Autoscheduler, so we want to give you like a 5-day plan instead of a 2-day plan, which is kind of the data visibility you have in a warehouse management system. We might integrate with your order management or your ERP as well. But there's a lot more data streams we can pull in. The primary one being a warehouse management system, though.
That's a crazy amount of data that goes into it, and I think that's what people don't realize. Right, you drive by the million square foot warehouse, and you're like, "Wow, that's really big. There must just be a lot of stuff in it." Well, there's also a lot of people and a lot of like activities going on at the same time and feeding each other, and it is a full production facility. And so, trying to organize that is crazy. I know I've stood on a couple warehouse floors and just thought, "How does this all happen?" It blows my mind. And then Calissa, you've really led a lot of our data initiatives. So hearing some of those things from Keith, like how do you think about that from our perspective and how we get data from the doc side?
Yeah, so when clients sign up for Opendock, they have to set up, their calendars and their availability. And we usually try to encourage them to set up the actual dock, like pretend like it's a physical dock and you can only allow one appointment or one driver to back up into that dock at one time. And I just keep thinking like, yeah, they need to be able to know where is that product and how to categorize these things in order to make sure that the driver can back in at the right part of the facility, because you don't, like you said, you don't want them to go from the west side of the facility and have the driver be backed into a door that's all the way on the north side. So yeah,
Well,
that's kind of how I was thinking about it.
and it's crazy because all those things just get into efficiency. It's not, I mean, sure, we could park anywhere and unload it, but when you're trying to scale these things and you have hundreds of people working there, reducing footsteps by 10, 20, 30% are just such a big deal in terms of costs and time to do these things. Um, so I'm curious. So Keith, do you only work with extremely large? I mean, have you started this journey with AutoScheduler at like the biggest of the big warehouses?
Yeah, I mean, our biggest customer is the largest consumer goods company in the world, right? Procter and Gamble. And so we're, the DCs and the warehouses we're looking at are, anywhere from the small side of like a few 100,000 square feet to well over 1 million square feet in size, huge, hundreds of doors. Uh, but that doesn't mean that's the only place we're relevant. We are relevant for smaller operations, more fulfillment center operations, transloading operations as well. Really working towards the optimization of those sites, and that's kind of what I love about working with you guys in the Opendock team is just I think the data that you guys are able to generate and how you're able to actually help set up customers to kind of manage that confluence of transportation and warehousing is an input for us that we can then use to do better optimization at the site and better manage the capability of the staff inside of the building.
I don't know that people ever fully grasp like how big a couple 100,000 square feet is. Like you can say the number and everyone's like, that's really big. I used to work in retail. That's like 5 or 6 Best Buys. Like the whole store fit in. And that's on the smaller side of some
Mhm.
of the warehouses. So you start to imagine like, wow, there's probably a ton of opportunity to make this more efficient. And you mentioned having an engineering background. So when you came into logistics as an engineer, were you like, this is crazy. Like, this is not an engineering approach to solving many of these problems.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. One of the things that blew my mind in even coming into supply chain is you have your early adopters and you have your laggards of technology, and I found supply chain unfortunately until COVID has really kind of fallen into that laggard category. Things that I had thought were commonplace were just not as prevalent, like for example the concept of transitioning to the cloud for most of your technology. um, a lot of companies still haven't made that transition, where if I go to like a financial services or a hedge fund and say, are you guys leveraging cloud compute? um, or do you leverage a cloud architecture to expand compute capabilities? They laugh. You'd be like, we've been doing that for 20 years. And you go to a warehouse and you're like, hey, where's your warehouse management system live? And they like point to some server under their desk. You're like, what? It's been a really eye-opening experience for me, and that not everybody's there. Different companies have different levels of maturity, but it's been really interesting for me to at least understand how different organizations are adopting technology, obviously accelerated by COVID now.
And Calissa, you've been leading our migration efforts, and so you've seen a pretty wide array of things from our customer list. What are some of the things you hear like on the technology front, or like that are surprising to you, or things that they're concerned about from a tech perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things I had heard from a recent prospect that was looking at purchasing our new platform, the Opendock platform, was that he was so elated and so excited that he didn't have to get his IT team involved in order to implement Opendock. And I was just kind of shocked because, I've been working in tech for a while and I'm like, oh yeah, you're kind of right. Like I don't have to worry about purchasing this SaaS product because I don't have to worry about the implementation piece of it. I can just do it all by myself. And that's kind of how he felt. And I was just kind of shocked by that because I think a lot of people feel like it's a whole huge project just to implement something so simple.
Yeah, it's hard. We've been fortunate. We're on the very lightweight side, right? We're not doing some of the heavy lift that you are, Keith. We're really just owning the doc and appointment scheduling piece. But people are always shocked when they start to hear the value you think you can bring them, and then it's like, all right, what's the timeline? What's the implementation cost? And they're always expecting like months, 20, $30,000. And to be fair, I've seen implementations. That money is well earned. They are so challenging, but they're always thrilled to find out. We're like, oh, doc scheduling is not that big a deal. We get you set up in like an hour and a half. They're like, just total? Yeah, yeah. Just log in, and it's kind of like setting up an Airbnb account or anything like that. Let's do the same thing. And it's always just so like refreshing for them. But it's also because we've taken something and just made it as simple as possible. We're not taking an entire WMS and laying over the top of it like you are, and then feeding them a bunch of inputs. And so I'm curious, you're trying to use all this technology to recommend things to them. Is trust a big challenge for you? Because I know sometimes that's a challenge for us. So you're basically saying, let us recommend how to run your warehouse better, and we'll just make these updates to your system. Does that freak customers
Oh
out?
yeah, I mean we're supercharging a full operation. It's like the closest analogy I can think of is if you guys have ever read the book The Goal, it's they go into this manufacturing facility and they process by process start to understand where are the constraints, how do we optimize around them, how do we maximize throughput to in order to enable sales. And we're kind of doing the whole same thing for a distribution center, but we're doing it where we're tying together, 4 or 5 different verticals that are individually managed at most of these sites. And so it's not just the IT integration that's required, but it's the change management of, hey, I understand that you guys allocate at 8 o'clock in the morning every day, but I'm here to tell you that you should be doing it every 4 minutes in an automated way based on when trailers are or aren't showing up, based on who is or isn't showing up to work that day, based on what space is available versus not available because somebody didn't show up. And you end up having to do a lot of, I call it explaining the butterfly effect. But when you deliver, right, somebody will say, well, you know, we had thought that we should do this at this time, but then auto scheduler changed it. Well, turns out these 3 trailers didn't show up at this time, which ended up with us having to change the use of these doors and this staging space and this labor utilization, which impacted that decision. And that's why it ended up being that way. And so a lot of it is coaching, but for us as well, we have to do a really thorough analysis on customer fit. We have to make sure that the customer's willing to innovate, and it is kind of dedicated in doing so. Because we find that if you end up dealing with people that aren't willing to adopt technology or willing to try new processes, you're going to fail just on the change management piece, as you kind of mentioned, which I envy the heck out of you guys on the IT and the change management integration. I wish I could go to somebody and say it was going to take an hour and a half. Um, so
Well, and what you just walked through there, though, it's crazy because your system's doing all these things, but you have to explain it to the customer because you have to justify the moves you made. So you probably have like some pretty detailed audit logs and things of like, we made this decision and here's why, because you need to be able to take them through it to kind of build credibility. Um, Calissa, I know you live with that in our world. Every conversation is around trust to the carriers to book or trust that people aren't making changes. Like, what are some of the things that's impacted from like a product side or us dealing with audits or making sure we have all this historical data? Like, what are some of the things you've worked on? I know it's an area you've had to deal with.
Yeah, I think a lot of times they're not just going to trust you, like just saying, oh, yeah, it's going to be fine. You have to have proof, And so, one of the big things, like making sure that carriers are going to comply with actually scheduling their own appointments online. We tell them we have about 75,000 carriers that do this all the time. So, you have to kind of give them the data and prove it all out. And then same with audit logs and tracking and showing them, hey, if somebody messes something up, we actually are capable of going back and tracking what had happened. So yeah, being able to prove that out is super important.
And we hear that so much, and I'm always to the goal of like, I want to get to Microsoft Office, like Microsoft Word, where everyone just assumes it's doing all the right things for you. But I can imagine like when it first came out, somebody's like, how do I know you're really saving my document? Or like, are you sure you captured all the edits? Like, I feel for probably what they went through. I really want to get to that standard where everyone's like, you're right, carriers do book online and it's okay. And I trust that my teams only edited the appointments they could without having to like work so hard to prove that. So I know we have a long way to go. Microsoft Word's been doing it for like 40 years. So we got some time to catch up.
I think for you guys in particular, it's only going to get more challenging, and because the service you guys are offering with being able to kind of dynamically schedule appointments with for all these different sites and facilities, like when companies like mine are becoming more and more mainstream, that becomes a data source that we rely on. And so I think you guys being able to establish that credibility is super important to me as well, because I need you to be successful, if that makes any sense.
No,
Definitely.
we think the same way because we think, oh, we're helpful and we have some value, but we really have way more value when we get plugged in to a system that can use us very intelligently. And so that kind of is a good segue into, I know we've chatted a little bit, like how do digital systems and supply chain like talk to one another? Because from my perspective, they don't do it very much. Although, I was in logistics 7 or 8 years ago, and it was not at all. So up to not very much is actually a big improvement. But like, what do you see in terms of how systems interact and what that looks like?
Yeah, it took me a while when we kind of moved into the logistic, or when I moved into logistics and supply chain space. All my partners have been here for decades at this point. But it took me a while to understand even all the different systems out there, right? And so, like at the high level, you have your ERP and order management solution, and then you have your TMS that's responsible for taking that demand plan and then actually booking transportation around, lane A, lane B, lane C, which lane being just an A to B connection. And then a lot of times you have your appointment scheduling solution once the transportation is booked comes into play, and they come in, they say, okay, well, we're going to book at the receiving destination first. So I booked at Walmart for 12 o'clock. I can back schedule. I need to book at Procter and Gamble for around 7 o'clock. Go book that a different way. And so your carriers are using that. But you're still talking about these kind of enterprise level software still. So your ERP, your OMS, your TMS, a bunch of acronyms, obviously, that everybody has to pick up. And the challenge I have is then a lot of that data gets what's called EDI, which is a predecessor to APIs, or like the common way to transfer data now, gets EDI down to their WMS, which is their warehouse management system. And so each individual site has a separate warehouse management system that is consuming all this data from your ERP, your TMS, your doc scheduling solution, even potentially your production management system, which there's different vendors that play there. And all of that kind of just funnels down to where they get dropped the next 48 hours of data with no insight into the whole network or anything else. And they're like, all right, go figure it out, make it work. So the lack of openness and extensibility in the software space in supply chain has been really interesting and a lot of times frustrating. I think there needs to be an establishment of common standards, particularly as we start to introduce systems like robotics. You have your AGVs and all of your different robotic operations, whether it's goods to picker versus just simple conveyors. The more and more softwares that have to interact and interoperate together and understand what somebody else is doing so that they can do their job well, means that there needs to be some standardization. And unfortunately, depending on the vendor, depending on the solution, you have everything from EDI to API to BAPI for SAP. And it's still a market that hasn't really been captured. And if I had to guess, I'm guessing there's a kind of a consortium that eventually gets put together that helps manage all of this, but we're not there yet. So it's still kind of a confusing mess of software. I don't know if you guys agree or disagree or where you see it going.
Yeah, I think we have thought a lot about building out our own standards as well, like having an Opendock, scheduling standard of some sort. And it's a huge endeavor. It's a huge project. It's a huge thought, right? It's just the very tip of the iceberg of what we're thinking about. But yeah.
But you guys have already built your own kind of standard interfaces to where anybody who wants to integrate with you, it's not like it's a hidden thing that they have to figure out. There's an open API, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So you can.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Calissa.
I was going to say, you can pull the data out. So once you set up Opendock, you can get the data out using our API, or you can also change the appointment information if you have another system like yours. And you can say, hey, we need to update the appointment to this other time because we know the driver's running late, or whatever other optimizations that your system is realizing that we need to do. Yeah.
But to your point, we do want to get to that standard, right? We need this open API revolution to know, hey, your customers are going to pick a variety of systems, right? Now we're at the point where I always think of it of like, there's a supply chain tech stack now, and it's 4 to 10 products usually. And those systems are so hard to talk to each other. And I know EDI is kind of standard. I remember people telling me like, I think EDI has been supposed to die for like 20 years now, but it hasn't. Like, people still use EDI, and they use EDI often. I mean, millions of transactions. It's just such a critical point. So I think we all agree, though, from the software side, like the API is just a more functional way to do this in an easier way. Mm-hmm. But that's hard. That's hard to convince people of. And it's like pulling out the plumbing from your house. Like, you don't take out the old plumbing unless something breaks, right? Because it's just such an endeavor. It's like baked into everything. You have to tear up the floors to get to it. And that's really how I see EDI. Have you kind of dealt with similar things, Keith?
Completely. I think people are just terrified to replace it. And I've even, I've talked to so many customers that have said the exact same thing, which is, oh, we had it on our roadmap 5 years ago to have EDI replaced in 2 years, and here we are, and we're still using it. I see us as kind of software vendors that play at the fringe of the core pieces of software that run supply chains, is being really responsible for helping to drive that change into the business and say, look, you guys may take longer to adopt it, but even when we're talking with each other, we're going to have really standard open interfaces. And so for all of our customers, that's been really valuable for them, is them saying, well, what do we need to integrate? And I'm like, API in, API out, really easy. I promise you don't have to learn new things to come work with us. Um, but even as we move into like the world of message brokers, like I don't know if you guys have heard of like Pulsar and Kafka and this concept of message queues for managing communication between services and service-oriented architectures. That's another direction the world may move. I just don't know, how long are APIs even going to be the thing. I think
It's a good point.
for me, it's just getting everybody on the same page right now, and we definitely have to get to the foundation, which I would say is API driven.
Yeah, and Calissa, I mean, you've done, a dozen plus integrations with us. Like, what are some of the things you encounter in those conversations? Like, are there open API standards, or does it usually feel like the first time where everything's really specific? Like, what do you deal with when you're working with large customers?
It's all customizable. It's all customized specific to their specific use case and all of the systems that they're using. And even just mapping the data from one system to another can be a big nightmare, a pain in the butt. So yeah, it can really be hard.
And we see that as just fragile, right? When you build something to only work with one thing, then any slight change just breaks it, right? And then that
Mhm.
turns into maintenance and tech debt and all these really hard things. And so we start talking about these open standards. It's just so helpful because you don't have to rebuild the same integration hundreds of times. You could build it once and hopefully use it. But I also don't envy, like, I think TMSs and WMSs and ERPs sometimes might get a bad rap of, oh, why are they not at the forefront of technology? And it's like, well, because they have thousands of really large billion-dollar customers. Like, it's easy for us to be small and nimble, right? We just,
Right.
we're growing, and even then we get nervous about changes, and we don't have the footprint those guys do. And so just telling them, just switch to API, like, I understand why that's not just a thing, but they're really going to have to lead the charge to help us get there.
Agreed. I completely agree. I think I'm really interested to see how the space evolves over the next few years.
So let me ask, have you got to be into a few of the warehouses, right? You're recommending all these solutions, and there's certainly like a physical and spatial component. So then have you been on site and on the floor at some of these really large warehouses?
Oh yeah, you almost have to be in some of the first engagements with customers. Not because we need it to actually install or do any of the software componentry, but just so that way we can get a real feel for the operation, and kind of draw out all of the different inventory flows through a building.
Yeah, so that's what I was curious what that's like in your world of. I know we always think about it of how we model it, but really, like, how do you look at something physical and then somehow give them the digital representation of what they want to do, right? Because you're not just drawing
Yeah.
out, here's your warehouse. It's not a schematic. You're like documenting someone needs to go pick this and move it to here. Like, how do you capture that digitally when you're watching it? It's real easy for me to watch and tell someone, hey, can you go pick that up? I'll go pick that up. We'll pallet it together. But to get a system to do that and like recognize that's what's happening, what goes into that?
Yeah, right. It's I go back to like engineering 101. It's always, put a dot on a page. There's a free body diagram that you start with to try to map everything out. We actually do the same thing. We break every site into a series of actors, actions, constraints, and flows. So you can literally say, okay, I have a rack, right? And how can inventory get to that rack and how can it leave? And which groups can be responsible for getting it there and which groups can be responsible for it leaving. And so think of it as almost you can draw a series of, basically arrows, like a flow chart of how inventory from the second it gets through the gate, all the different arrows for different directions it can go, which groups can do it. So it may be if you're pulling something from a rack to a staging space at a consumer goods site, that can be somebody on a forklift. It can be somebody on a reach truck. It could also be an AGV or an LGV if there's automated guided vehicles. All of those have different work standards or different speeds at which they operate. And then you try to take all of that and then tie it with the constraints of the site. Like you can't load a trailer more than 24 hours in advance because it might have perishable product that can't sit over a certain temperature for a certain period of time. And you basically build out that whole flow. And it sounds like a lot, but it takes a day or two. It's like not a huge time consuming process once you get good at it. And then we basically take all of that and have a massive configurable algorithm that we just say, okay, drop this in, it gets configured, and then the optimization can run as soon as we have the data.
So it's safe to say you're pretty process driven.
You have to be. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine
I think
you guys are the same, right?
uh, we are. I mean, Calissa is. So like when you're speaking about this, I'm thinking like this is a 20-foot by 10-foot flow chart with hundreds of objects, thousands of objects connecting all these things, and like that's what Calissa outputs too. Like she sees the process very much, and like if we trained a machine to do this, Calissa could prescribe that machine how to operate, and it would do it effectively. But then I'm asked to make a flow chart, and it's like 3 boxes. I'm like, we'll go grab it from here, and we'll take it into there, and it's all good. And then it
Yeah.
was like, hold on, who does it? I was like, well, anybody who's
Yeah.
moving around could grab it. And you're like, Jeff, this is not the appropriate way to architect this system.
I like your strategy.
So yeah, so I write the first diagram, and it's like obnoxiously simple. So everyone's like, I get what he's doing, but this is actually not helpful in programming or designing anything. And then Calissa takes it and is like, I think what Jeff really meant to say were the following 800 things that I assumed and never like explicitly documented.
You don't give yourself enough credit. You provide a lot of input for sure,
but it's all like high level. Like it's crazy when you're describing this. I'm like, oh my gosh, if I was in Keith's role, I would be a mess. Like I could see some of the data, I could see how the floor works, but like you just have to be so detail oriented and like understanding what they're doing and like capturing that in such an effective way that like I don't know, when you tell me about a tool like auto scheduler, like whatever you charge to implement that or anything, I can already tell you it's well worth it, whatever that amount is, because there's just so much effort and such a skill into getting there.
It's still pretty fast. I mean, if you look at what we're doing versus what, a warehouse management system or some of the other big software solutions are doing, we're going to be so much faster just because we do have it down to a process to kind of your point. So
Yeah.
it's a pretty straightforward thing. Most of the customers know it. Again, there's that change management aspect to some degree, but I always tell everybody, and this is for any AI or analytics project. And Calissa, you probably have heard this before, but one of my like tenets of success is if you can't explain it as a person, there's no way you can expect any automated machine learning system to do it well. If you can't explain what you want and how you might walk through it as a person, you're going to fail.
for sure.
That's a really good like philosophy. Like that's a good anchor to building and designing things.
Yeah,
And
it's must do.
and so I wanted to pivot a little bit just to like being in the warehouse. I know we only have a few more minutes here, but Calissa, we've toured a few warehouses. I mean, you've been in quite a few of them, just visiting our customers and prospects. What's like the craziest thing you saw? Not like a fist fight, but like what was something you saw where it was like, wow, like I can't believe that's a thing or that happens.
Oh gosh. I mean, there are just so many different processes that blow my mind. I won't name anybody because I think I'll get in a lot of trouble because we're still working with them. Um, but I went to a distribution center the other day, and it was for a fulfillment center type of operation, and they were unloading a bunch of inventory, and during their unloading process, they have to make sure that what they thought was on a trailer was actually on the trailer. There's a lot of unique ways to do that, but I sat there and watched as they had these associates on the floor, literally on their hands and knees, counting tiny pieces. And for the folks that can't see, my fingers are like an inch, so things that were like an inch big that were filling up a whole tractor trailer, and they were counting individual pieces to make sure that the count was correct versus what they thought was on the trailer. And so I started to ask, like, how long does that take you? And they're like, oh, well, it could take 20 hours for this one trailer to just count all the pieces. And that's a full person that's probably making, now with COVID, like $30 fully loaded an hour, that is then doing that for 20 hours to just count individual small items. And I'm not going to say what the items are because then that'll give the customer away. Where
I
there's
wish
just
I could say I wish I could tell you like this was like alarming to me in any way, but I worked at Circuit City and I was a GM there and we'd receive product and like as a guy who sat down and counted like 268 printer ink cartridges, I get it.
Yeah,
Like I've been there.
like you're spending $30 per hour for that person's time. That is costing
You
you more than them being off by
that
7 items.
I was gonna say it was always crazy because you almost it's just so much more effective to eyeball it, peek in, be like, that's about a couple hundred because it's cheaper. It is cheaper to lose them, not have them, and not tell anyone about it than it is to count them.
Right, because yeah, I mean, there are so many techniques like weighing them, for example, and if it's within some degree of tolerance, you're like, okay, check. But that was probably the most mind-blowing to me just because of the amount of time for the almost zero return.
That's huge. Calissa, I know we've gone to quite a few of these places. Like, what's something you've seen where you're like not growing up in the warehouse world? Like, what was something that surprised you or shocked
Oh,
you?
I had no idea, and I don't even know what this device is called, but I'm sure there's some term for it. I had no idea that they had like these headphones where the person would have to walk and be told exactly where to pick up an item, and I think the people were called pickers, right? And so you would
Yeah,
have to just like program this, device to speak to them to tell them take a left now and take a right now and stop here and look up, two shelves and all
And
of
I
that.
think
It's like,
Keith helps optimize these.
so we work with sites that are using them. Yeah, think of them as they would be a consumer of our plan.
okay,
And that's a really cool
That,
technology. It actually drives a lot of value for those sites.
that was really
well, it's
cool.
huge, right? Because as a person, how long would it take me to? I can't even memorize the same fries I've been going to for 10 years, right? Like in the aisles. Imagine how much 100,000 square foot. There's no way. So having that voice guided is just huge. Yeah, I agree. I think the other thing too, I've wrapped a lot of pallets with plastic wrap and seeing the machines that do it, it's just crazy. Like just gets launched in there, spins around. You're like, whoa, that used to take me like 30 minutes, and I did a really crappy job of it too.
Yeah, those things are so
They're
cool.
really cool.
They're awesome, but then I'm constantly terrified. I'm like, if I misstep, like, am I going to get like shrink wrapped in it? Like, what is the safety standards? And like, I start to get worried about being around like heavy industrial equipment and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, look, we've been chatting for about half an hour. I don't know that we have like obviously our first episode. We don't have like a standard, but I feel like I want to build in like something we always do. So maybe we can try this, and if it goes poorly, we'll just cut it and figure something out. But Keith, I want to know what's like your hot take on the future of supply chain. Like, do you have like a hot take
Ooh.
or a view or something where you're like, this is my view of the future of supply chain in some way? It can be tech, it can be not, whatever you got.
So it's a hot take. It's definitely a hot take because I haven't heard anybody write about it. Um,
Okay,
but
I'm
I,
psyched now.
I wrote an article recently that I can't publish because it kind of badmouths how people are integrating robotics. Again, I
Okay.
think robotics are awesome. I love them, right? I have a control systems background. But my hot take is I think 3PLs are going to start to get squeezed out by robotics vendors at sites, meaning that standard operator 3PL that runs distribution centers, as people introduce more and more automation, they end up having more and more automation maintenance staff on the floor taking time from those 3PLs. And as they introduce more and more, the role of the 3PL becomes smaller and smaller. And eventually, robotics vendors are basically going to become 3PLs. So that's my hot take for warehousing for the day.
That's a good one. So then if I were from your perspective, then if I were a 3PL and I ran, 50 to 100 warehouses, I should be at the forefront of this robotics revolution. So I could have the best robots, the most efficient, and I could be leading this charge so customers never have to go figure that out. I could just be the source.
Right. And unfortunately with how those contracts are written, because they're not 10-year contracts, and the payback on a robotic system is not a year or two most often. It's generally going to be a period of time. And so it's hard for them to justify the investment uh, unless they're being pushed by their customer. And so I think 3PLs are in a really tough position. It's only going to get tougher over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and it'll really be interesting once we see some of those first big players through the wall, right? Of, hey, we're going to X% robotics, and especially getting into autonomous vehicles, like who are going to be the first people through the wall to demonstrate that and show what it can be like?
Yeah. I'm so excited to see that.
That's a good hot take. Calissa, do you have a hot take, or do you have anything else to add, or what are your any thoughts on that before we close out?
That would be phenomenal to see all the robots and stuff. I mean, I haven't been to a warehouse that actually has that automation, and Jeff keeps promising that one day he's going to take me maybe to like an Amazon warehouse or something. So we'll have to do that because I would love to see some of that in action. I've seen videos, right? But in person would be really cool.
Yeah, Keith, do you have like, I don't know if we're sensitive to names, but do you have a certain company where you're like, I think these guys are really at the forefront, whether it's a robotics provider, vendor, or like a shipper who's like, I think they do this really well. Do you have someone out there that people should pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, Gartner does a really good job of recognizing them already, but Procter and Gamble has been extremely innovative about how they've run their business. We wouldn't be a company if it wasn't for them, right? And so I have to give them a shout out on saying they have a really good supply chain team. They invest in IT very heavily. There's some really other good consumer goods companies out there. Like I've been really impressed with what we've seen from General Mills and just their appetite for innovation and their ability and willingness to go invest in new technologies. Not even ourselves, right? Just some of the things they're doing. But P&G is kind of the gold standard for innovation, independent of Amazon.
Well, there you go. Now I have my task. I'm going to go around on LinkedIn and I'm going to beg someone who works I think they probably have a facility here in Phoenix or Tolleson. And I'm going to cold call them and beg them to just let us go see a tour of what they got going on if they'll let us.
Give me a shout after this and we can talk about that.
Awesome. Yeah, you don't want me just peppering everyone on LinkedIn. Hey, can we get into your warehouse? Like, who is this guy? So cool. Well, look, I think this was pretty solid for our first time ever recording a podcast. Keith, thank you so much for being our inaugural guest, and we look forward to recording a bunch more of these.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for having me.
It was great.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, guys.